All right, we're live, buddy.
All right.
Thank you so much for coming on this crazy trip with me and doing this interview. So we making a pretty good pace.
Absolutely.
And we'll...
this is Sydney Point, by the way.
The beautiful Sydney Point.
In Muskoka. Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Yeah, I can't even believe.
We got a great shot for you today, so enjoy. And it's on point because what are we talking today?
We're talking about Hobbes.
Yes, Hobbes.
Where else would you come other than Muskoka to talk about a 17th century philosopher?
Exactly. This guy right here.
That guy, yeah, the man, the myth, the legend.
There he is.
So why don't a tiny bit of background on Hobbes? So,
yes.
Hobbes, correct me if I'm wrong, is Scottish?
Scottish.
English? This is the part where we don't know anything. Hobbes is from the UK, that is for sure. What do I know? Oh, the pieces are starting to come back. He definitely did school in the UK. Hobbes started, if I recall properly, as a classicist, translating Thucydides, something like that. What I'm remembering is he translates one of the first translations into English of a major text on the war between Athens and Sparta.
Okay.
And what is, of course, important about the war between Athens and Sparta is that Athens is democratic and Sparta is deeply not, and Athens loses the war.
Right.
And this is, of course, and it's important, I think it is Thucydides, and this is important because for Hobbes, he is looking at this division between these two things. He's seeing this authoritarian state succeed over this democratic state, and he's also got a lot of criticisms about people and how they function and what they do.
Right.
You've all heard of the nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, so,
in the state of nature, life would be nasty, brutish, and short.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so, Hobbes is simultaneously trying to walk the line between having that crazy state of nature be awful, having the current state of affairs that he's living with not actually be that much to his favor.
Right.
It's all coming back to me now. So he lives during this really critical period in English history, this English Revolution that occurs. You have Oliver Cromwell rising to power, essentially, in this bizarre moment of confusion, essentially. And Hobbes is in a moment of political and mental crisis because he has allegiance to Charles I, I believe it is. And this allegiance, of course, gets into really weird territory when Charles I is killed.
Right.
And you have to figure out, okay, there are other people out there, but the dominant force in the nation is no longer explicitly royal.
Right.
And this is a moment of real confusion for him. And he makes his big sort of progressive concession, allegedly, there. He says, okay, you can be loyal to your king, but if your king is no longer able to protect your people, is he really a king anymore?
Right.
Then our loyalty is already sort of fragmented.
Interesting.
And so the only way we can resolve that situation is to give allegiance to a royal leader who's actually in charge of things, as opposed to one who's dead, or not doing anything. So that's our basic sort of setup with Hobbes.
Right.
I think what's interesting about us to Hobbes today is he really is, he's at this pivotal moment in British history, in the history of democracies as a whole, and he is writing this form of philosophy that doesn't really exist anymore.
And you'll read it, you'll see.
Exactly. So in order to take this off, the title of the book is Leviathan. It's a great title.
Oh, yeah.
What is a Leviathan in terms of the biblical context?
So Leviathan appears most famously in the book of Job, but it also appears in the Psalms as well as the apocryphal book of Enoch, and it's a monster. It's a large sea creature, vast in size and proportion, and it comes to represent often the embodiment of chaos. And it's in later Catholic theology, it actually is associated with the demon of envy.
Wow, I didn't know that at all.
Yeah, which is really interesting. That giant, massive sea creature. Of course, Hobbes is not using it in that sense, even though he's making symbolic allusions to it. He's using it to describe a political entity, i.e. the state.
Yes, exactly. So for Hobbes, the Leviathan is this massive, unwieldy thing that he thinks of as the state. But I like the biblical approach there because it explains the sort of essence of criticism that is really at the root of this whole book, which I think is really interesting. And he's constantly, he's very critical. But because he's in a stage where being very critical of, the state, really puts you at risk of just death.
Yeah.
Just instant
Couldn't
death.
do this. Couldn't do it without consequences.
And this is explicit in English law, if you want to go and check.
Yeah.
But, it puts you at instant risk of death.
Right.
So he has to couch his entire vernacular, all of his language, in this really remarkable way. And you create these very dense sort of pseudo-philosophical texts that are based out of... based really in sort of the Spinoza tradition of trying to go through and put each section. It's not, later on we get analytical philosophy that's all about if P then Q. This stuff isn't, we're not there yet.
Right.
What we have here instead as our basic structure is like just putting lists on everything. So there's lots of places in this book where he breaks into like 20 definitions or 20 different ways of doing things or yada yada. Now we're going to hopefully find one in a couple seconds.
But exactly. It breaks it out. So here, for example, by manners, I mean not here decency of behavior, or I mean other points such as small morals, right? Yes. So ideally, there's 6 different terms he used in the first sentence.
Yes.
Of
exactly.
His text.
And this might not seem much to you, but this like very atomic breakdown of individual things into what's supposed to be precise language. This thing is this, but it's definitely not that.
Yeah.
This is very difficult to do. It's something we don't do very much these days because just establishing borderlines between 2 different concepts and subjects is really challenging.
Exactly.
I think our conversation about hyperobjects the other day really showed as well.
Really showed it. Yeah, and we were talking about Hobbes. Interesting as we were kind of just making some notes on what we were going to say. And, I think I benefit a lot from living in my time, which was after deconstructionism and post-structuralism. So, these are big words, but how that kind of boils down to is when you study structures, and especially narrative structures, and you have more of a sense of history and how narratives are formed, you can't just make up whatever you want with certain terms, right?
Yep.
Like those terms have to be kind of located in their historical context. They have to be deconstructed, right? And understood properly if you're going through that framework. But Hobbes isn't operating with anything like that.
No. And in some ways, it's the Wild West. He gets to say pretty much whatever he wants. Unless he violates particular social and political norms of the day, in which case he dies. Yeah. So, that's a fascinating intellectual context to sort of try and engage with.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is really interesting about this is because Hobbes is in so many ways a mishmash, as we've been describing this whole time. He's in so many ways a mishmash of different things, pulling from different places. Yeah. His idea of psychology, of consciousness, is really interesting to me because he sees the mind everywhere. It's a very sort of panpsychist, and there's of course long before panpsychism, there's a very Christian, Holy Spirit within us all, within everything. God is in us all, sort of aspect to it as well, which of course he's in much closer dialogue with.
Right.
But still, he'll be talking about numbers or shapes or objects, and then all of a sudden he'll realize that like our perceptions of those things matter, and he'll start talking about the mind and consciousness and structure. And this is something that's just lost from modern academic debate. If I'm reading a book about psychology, I'm reading a book about psychology these days. It's in there, it's on it, it's all about psychology. If you go and do any math in your psychology book, you do it very briefly and very hesitantly, usually. Right. Then you get right back over to doing your other thing. Right. You don't have this same sort of thing on this period. You just like, I'd get to do this for fun, and I'm going to do this for fun, and I'm going to make an argument for why they're the same thing or why they're compatible. And
put them all together. Yeah, it's very synthetic. He's synthesizing a lot. Yeah. And he's paying a lot of attention to kind of, I think it goes into psychology, to particular words, right? For him, particular words matter to describe particular states of the mind, it seems like. He spends, I think, 5 pages talking about the difference between to be an error or to be absurd, right? And essentially it boils down to, for him, I think, that the words can be absurd, but a person can be an error, right? I think that's, it's something like that. that, right?
I don't remember that bit.
Yeah, it's okay. It's
Yeah. That's okay.
so, but you know, and that can sound a little bit, you know, crazy to us, but he's really trying to kind of get at the different layers of thought, emotion, decision making, reasoning, flawed reasoning. So he's a very kind of psychological philosopher in that sense. Yeah,
very much so. And the whole sort of empirical base. So empiricism is perhaps the most famous philosophical concept that emerges out of Hobbes and a couple of other guys working in his time. The other most famous one, I think, is Descartes. I think he... No, that's not really...
Locke?
That's not true. Descartes is a dualist, sorry. There's empiricist aspects of Descartes as well, though. Sorry. Locke is definitely the other most famous.
Yeah.
Who's up next on the reading list? But empiricism is something that people thought was really well defined when they were coming up with it. They're like, all we have to do is go to the reality, go to the actual facts, do some study. This is real stuff, and then we measure it, and away we go. And that's our basis for reality. And anything that is more ethereal than that, we don't really worry about.
Right.
The fact that empiricism came along during an era when people were extraordinarily religious all the time is really fascinating to contemplate. But the basic aspect of empiricism then is trying to understand the physical material world just based on actual physical material information and analysis.
Right.
As opposed to, say, creating complex psychological objects or hypothetical philosophical objects like hyperobjects to try and draw conclusions in a totally different way. Empiricists are much more about science, right? In this period, 17th century, what is science at this point? Science is just a general learned way of achieving information. And there is some understanding arising around this exact same time that there actually has to be some sort of specific method, but science is still going to be used in a general term for just learned knowledge for the next couple hundred years. All of which is obviously kind of tying into our whole there. But yeah, so for me, I think the reason we're still reading Hobbes all this time,
400 years later almost,
is in part because it is so radically different, because this is a sort of philosophy that we don't feel comfortable doing anymore, and that most places wouldn't publish.
No.
And for me, I think, as somebody who is very specifically interdisciplinary and trying to cross fields, and that's something that I find extremely interesting about Hobbes. And on a basic level, for me, he does a good job, almost by coincidence, of combining two things that I find really important and interesting. And on the one side, it's the psychological aspect, the psyche, how do we observe nature, what matters about our observations. And on the other side, it's the structural aspect, the political nature of things. And obviously, the observation of nature, and I love this connection that Hobbes makes, the observation of nature really matters if you are in charge of a bunch of people making political decisions. Because if you have inaccurate observations, you tell people to do things, they do what you ask, but you get the wrong result. Right? So this link between psychology and society, I find really fascinating through political science.
Absolutely, and it's important because more fashionable writers like Freud, with Civilization and its Discontents, are also doing something similar later on, although using much more kind of advanced psychoanalysis.
Much later on.
But they're still kind of making an empirical sort of psychological synthesis.
Very
Freud's
much so.
doing that like 300 years later.
And Freud is attempting. So Freud is using empiricism because he believes that he has a specific technique. You think of lying on couches and having people analyze you. That is part of his very specific technique for obtaining what he sees as empirical data, which is ultimately for him mostly the free associations of people's dream data, so of their dream recollections, and then he uses that and analyzes it according to this framework that he's built up that is also supposed to be based on his dream analysis, to produce this sort of link between what he sees as an empirical process and learning about the psyche. Of course, whether or not there even is an empirical process that gives us accurate information about psychological matters is a huge question still.
Yeah, and I think it's a huge debate. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, but whenever I hear, about where we are with the brain, they're always like, "Oh, we've made such progress. We understand so much more, but we really don't have any idea what's going on for most of it, right?"
Totally,
That's kind of the summation I get.
And I think both those things are true.
And both those things can be true, and hopefully both those things are true for a while. I'm actually a fan of us being able to plumb the depths of the human mind and keep learning more and more about it. That's a nice facet of ourselves, right?
Yeah, no, I think the psyche is pretty unrelenting. There's all sorts of fascinating ways and places in which I see breakthroughs in our lifetime, scientifically and in terms of philosophical knowledge, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, yeah.
But that's really not one of them. I'm hoping there will someday be great breakthroughs in psychology, but I don't even see the framework through which they would be obtained at this stage. Which is part of the reason I'm coming back to people like Hobbes.
Yeah.
When you're... And this is maybe good for people at home who are looking at their own fields of interest and study and are being honest with themselves and being like, gosh, this is stagnant. Things haven't changed in the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
Or even longer if you're talking about things like physics.
Yeah.
This is stagnant. What do I do when my field becomes stagnant? When I'm bored or am I finding materials interesting? And going back to the roots is one of the...
Going back to the roots, and also, as you talked about, like what he's doing, right? What Hobbes is doing, what you're trying to do. What Freud was trying to do with civilization is this consensus. They're trying to trespass into other disciplines and talk about them. They're trying to do something transdisciplinarian, and I think that's if you're feeling stuck in a rut, you got to get out of that rut and maybe move sideways instead of forwards and
find a new discipline.
But no, that's great.
Well, thank you so much for talking about this with me, buddy.
Awesome.
It's Hobbes, Leviathan, Ancient Philosophers.
Great.
Appreciate you so much.
Appreciate you, man. Thanks, man.